Henry Weston built an empire with precision and control, until the day he walked into his luxury restaurant and found two small boys scrubbing tables like they didn't belong anywhere else. Henry Weston didn't believe in surprises. As the CEO of one of the most exclusive restaurant chains in the country, he had built his entire empire on precision, timing, and absolute control. He wasn't the kind of man to visit his restaurants without notice. Inspections were left to regional managers and performance reports. But on that particular afternoon, something inside him, restlessness maybe, or simple curiosity, drove him to step out of his black car and walk unannounced through the glass doors of his flagship restaurant downtown. He expected to be greeted with elegance and efficiency, spotless white tablecloths, polished silverware, and the quiet hum of staff who knew exactly how to move in rhythm with the brand he had cultivated for over a decade. What he did not expect to see, as he stepped into the main dining room, were two small boys standing on stools, struggling to wipe down tables that were nearly twice their size. They looked no older than 7. Their shirts were too large, sleeves rolled up clumsily, and they moved with a seriousness that didn't belong to children. Each one mirrored the other, same dark eyes, same tired expressions, same too thin arms wiping with damp cloths. The room, though half filled with afternoon guests, fell into an awkward silence as some customers began to take notice. Henry froze in place. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. A publicity stunt? Some misguided promotional idea? But no, this wasn't part of any plan. He turned sharply toward the restaurant manager, who stood near the kitchen entrance, pale and already trembling under Henry's stare. "Who are they?" Henry asked, his voice low, controlled, dangerous. The manager fumbled his words before managing to explain that the boys had shown up 2 days ago asking if they could help in exchange for food. Their mother had been admitted to the hospital, no guardian, no contact information. The kitchen staff, moved by pity, had let them work in exchange for meals. They didn't ask for money, the manager added quietly, just something to eat. Henry didn't speak for several seconds. He turned back toward the boys, who were now watching him with wide, alert eyes. They weren't afraid, not exactly. They looked ready to be dismissed, prepared for rejection like they had seen it before. There was something unnerving about how still they stood, how they didn't fidget or whine. They looked used to silence and shame. He felt something shift in his chest, something sharp and unfamiliar. Without another word, he walked straight to them and crouched slightly to meet their height. "What are your names?" he asked. They looked at each other, unsure if they should answer. Finally, one of them whispered, "Zach," and the other added, "Lucas." Their voices were hoarse, not from illness, but from exhaustion. He looked at them a moment longer, then stood and spoke to the staff with finality in his tone. "They don't work here anymore. They're coming with me." No one questioned him. He escorted the boys out of the restaurant, past rows of diners who had lowered their forks and watched in stunned silence. The valet pulled up the car, and Henry opened the door himself. Once inside, he told the driver to take them to the hotel he used for international guests. He ordered a suite with 2 bedrooms, meals delivered, new clothes arranged immediately. He didn't fully know what he was doing, only that the thought of leaving them behind felt impossible. As the car moved through the city, he studied them in the rearview mirror. They sat side by side, close but not touching, their eyes fixed ahead, hands in their laps. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by power and structure, Henry Weston had no idea what came next. But something deep inside him told him one thing with brutal certainty: these boys were not strangers. And this was not a coincidence. The suite Henry arranged for the boys was among the best in the hotel: 2 bedrooms, soft bedding, a quiet view of the city skyline, and a stocked kitchenette with snacks and juice boxes they barely touched. Once inside, Zach and Lucas stood near the doorway as if they weren't sure they were actually allowed to enter. Their feet didn't move past the rug, and their eyes scanned every detail like they were waiting to be told they didn't belong. Henry watched them, unsure of how to bridge the massive emotional distance between them. He had no experience comforting children, let alone two boys who had clearly been living in survival mode for much longer than anyone their age should. He knelt to their level, not because he had read it in a parenting book, but because something instinctive told him towering over them wasn't going to help. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's going to ask you to leave. You don't have to do anything. You just need to rest." The boys didn't respond, but Lucas finally stepped forward and asked if they had to work in the morning. Henry shook his head and told them again that they didn't owe anyone anything. They looked at each other like they were trying to decode a language they had never heard spoken before. Once he managed to coax them into changing into fresh clothes, a matching set of soft t-shirts and sweatpants delivered by hotel staff, he ordered room service. They barely touched the food, but Henry noticed the way their eyes lit up when the waiter brought a small tray of ice cream. They didn't eat it right away, instead, they seemed to wait for permission. Henry simply nodded, and with quiet relief, they started to eat slowly, savoring every bite like they weren't sure when they might have dessert again. Later that evening, while the boys watched a cartoon in the other room, Henry sat in the study area with his phone, making calls. He needed answers. He called the hospital, confirmed that their mother, Emily Carter, was still unconscious. Her condition was stable, but there was no telling when, or if, she would wake. He asked about next of kin. There were none listed. No father on file. No emergency contacts. She had come in alone, and the staff had been grateful the boys hadn't been left completely on their own. Henry leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Emily. He hadn't seen her in over 8 years. Their story had been brief, intense, and unfinished. She'd left town without a word, and though he tried to find her, she'd vanished completely. Now she was unconscious in a hospital bed, and these two boys, her sons, were in his hotel suite, watching cartoons and flinching every time a door closed too loudly. He stepped back into the living area and found them both dozing off, Lucas half asleep on one side of the couch and Zach still upright, blinking slowly at the screen. Henry turned off the TV and offered to help them into bed. They didn't protest. As he pulled up the blankets, Zach looked at him with cautious eyes and asked, "Are we going back to the restaurant tomorrow?" Henry knelt beside the bed and shook his head. "No. Not tomorrow. Not ever." Zach didn't smile, but his eyes softened. That night, as both boys drifted into sleep, Henry sat alone on the couch and scrolled through old messages and emails, looking for anything, any sign, that Emily had tried to contact him in the past. There was nothing. The next morning, he ordered DNA tests. It was a quiet decision, methodical but heavy. He needed to know the truth, even though he already suspected it. The resemblance was too strong, the timing too exact. He left early to meet with a private lab, submitted his sample, and arranged for the boys' tests to be taken later in the day under gentle supervision. When he returned to the suite, Lucas ran up to show him a drawing of a house, with 3 stick figures and the sun drawn far too large. "This one's you," Lucas said, pointing to the tallest figure. "Because you found us." Henry didn't correct him. He didn't have the words to explain what was happening yet. All he knew was that something irreversible had begun. And he wasn't walking away from it. 2 days later, the results arrived. The envelope was thin but carried more weight than anything Henry had held in his hands in years. He sat at the desk in the hotel suite, his fingers resting on the sealed flap for a long moment before finally tearing it open. The paper inside was brief, clinical, without emotion, but the words were undeniable. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Zach and Lucas were his sons. Not in theory, not in speculation, but in absolute, biological truth. He leaned back in the chair, the paper still in his hand, as the weight of it sank through his chest and into the rest of his being. 1,000 unspoken questions about the past were replaced by one quiet certainty: he hadn't just found 2 boys in a restaurant, he had found his children. He didn't tell them right away. He wasn't ready. Not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to be sure he would say it right, that he could offer something more than just the truth. He wanted to offer safety, permanence, something they had clearly never known. That evening, as the boys played a quiet board game on the carpet, Henry sat on the edge of the couch and simply watched them. He studied the curve of their smiles when they teased each other, the identical way they furrowed their brows when they concentrated. It wasn't just that they looked like him, although they did. It was the way something inside him responded to them without effort, like he had known them his whole life without even realizing it. That night, as he helped them brush their teeth and settle into bed, he found himself hesitating in the doorway. Zach was already half asleep, his arm flung over his face. Lucas looked up from his pillow and whispered, "Are you gonna stay here tonight?" Henry nodded. "I'll be right in the other room." Lucas thought about that for a moment, then asked, "For how long?" The question wasn't casual. It was heavy with the kind of fear a child should never have to carry. Henry sat on the edge of the bed and said, "As long as you'll have me." The next morning, he began making arrangements. He contacted his legal team and asked them to initiate guardianship paperwork. Since the boy's mother was still unconscious, the case would need special handling, but the DNA results were on his side. Still, Henry wasn't just trying to check a legal box, he wanted to be ready for anything. If Emily woke up and wanted her sons back, if she accused him of abandonment or worse, he wanted to have done everything right. Not for himself, but for Zach and Lucas. Later that day, he took them to the park for the first time. It was nothing extravagant, just a quiet corner of the city with swings and a climbing structure. They were hesitant at first, unsure if they were really allowed to run, to laugh, to take up space. But eventually, Lucas raced across the grass, and Zach followed, both of them barefoot and smiling. Henry stood near a bench and watched them, arms crossed but heart wide open. For the first time, he saw what they could be, not just what they had survived. When they returned to the hotel, the boys fell asleep early, exhausted from play and full from takeout pizza they had chosen themselves. Henry stood at the window after they were in bed, the city humming quietly below. He thought about the moment years ago when Emily had disappeared, about the silence that had followed, and about how a life he hadn't even known existed had now taken root right in front of him. He looked at their drawings taped to the wall, one of a house, one of a restaurant, and one of a man with two small boys holding each of his hands. Underneath, in Lucas's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Found us." Henry reached out and gently touched the paper. The truth was written there before he had ever opened that envelope. The test had only confirmed what his heart already knew. Henry moved the boys out of the hotel and into his penthouse by the end of the week. The transition wasn't simple, but it was necessary. The suite had been elegant and sterile, a place for business travelers and formal meetings, not for children who needed comfort and safety. He spent several days overseeing the transformation of the second bedroom into a shared space for Zach and Lucas. He had no idea what kinds of blankets 7-year-old boys preferred, or how many bookshelves they'd need, but he let them decide. They picked out dinosaur posters, beanbags in bold colors, and a galaxy-themed lamp that made the ceiling glow at night. He ordered twin beds with soft mattresses and had their names stitched into the pillows, not for luxury, but so they would know they belonged. Zach unpacked slowly and carefully, folding his clothes with quiet precision, while Lucas exploded his half of the room in 10 minutes, toys scattered, drawers left open, socks mismatched. Henry watched them from the doorway, a strange feeling blooming in his chest, something between wonder and disbelief. The space no longer looked like his own, and that was exactly how he wanted it. They began to fall into something that resembled a routine. In the mornings, Henry made coffee and toast, often with the assistance, or interference, of Lucas, who insisted on pressing every button on the coffee machine. Zach was more independent, getting dressed on his own and brushing his teeth without being told, but Henry could see in both of them the subtle gestures that came from long months or even years of raising themselves. At night, they preferred to be read to, even though they could read on their own. Henry sat between their beds, book in hand, while the city buzzed outside their windows. It became his favorite part of the day. Sometimes, the past crept in. Lucas would wake up from nightmares and cry silently until Henry came and sat beside him. Zach would ask questions he didn't know how to answer, like why their mom had been so tired all the time, or why they hadn't had birthdays for the last 2 years. Henry never lied. He said he didn't know, but he promised they'd have every birthday from now on, no matter what. He kept his word. That Saturday, he threw them a joint first party, with a cake too big and streamers hung clumsily across the kitchen. Neither of the boys knew how to blow out candles, so Henry showed them. When they made their wishes, they closed their eyes tightly, hands clasped together like they were holding on to something invisible but precious. Henry had started visiting the hospital more often. Emily remained unconscious, and her condition hadn't changed. He sat beside her bed, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking quietly about the boys. He told her about Lucas's drawings and Zach's seriousness, about the way they had begun calling him Dad naturally, without ceremony. He told her that they were okay, that he was trying, that he hadn't left them even though he hadn't known they existed. One day, he brought a photograph, one the boys had taken with a hotel concierge, smiling with paper crowns on their heads. He placed it on the table beside her bed. "They're strong, Emily," he said. "You'd be proud of them. I'm trying to be someone they can count on." He didn't know if she heard, but it didn't matter. He had started saying the things he never got to say before. Meanwhile, his company had begun to question his absence. Investors were growing impatient, wondering why he was missing meetings and skipping travel. Henry had once feared this kind of disruption. But now, he felt nothing but resolve. He wasn't walking away from his empire. He was redefining what success meant. For the first time in his life, it had nothing to do with margins or market shares. It was measured in bedtime stories, laughter over spilled juice, and 2 boys who had started to smile like they meant it. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold over the city, Henry stood in the boys' doorway and watched them argue over a board game. It was a small, ordinary moment, but it held everything. He had lived most of his life in polished silence. Now, there was noise. And chaos. And love. He realized he no longer felt like he was learning to be a father. He simply was one. Not perfect. Not always confident. But present. And that, for the boys, was enough. It happened just as things were beginning to feel steady, almost natural. Henry had adjusted to life with Zach and Lucas, and they had started to settle into his world as if they had always been a part of it. The mornings no longer felt like rehearsals, and the boys didn't ask anymore if they were staying for just a few more nights. The 3 of them moved through daily life with a rhythm that was both quiet and powerful. And then, like a sharp knock against fragile glass, disruption came in the form of a legal notice. Henry found the envelope waiting on the kitchen counter when he returned from picking the boys up from school. It had been hand-delivered, addressed formally to him. Inside were court documents. A woman named Carol Monroe, a distant relative of Emily's, someone he had never heard of, had filed for emergency guardianship of Zach and Lucas. She claimed he was an unfit guardian with no legal right to keep the boys in his home, arguing that they should be placed with their biological family. She had cited her own status as a blood relation, and claimed the boys were in emotional danger due to the recent upheaval in their lives. The words hit him like a sudden chill. She had no idea who he was. She didn't know the boys. But she wanted them anyway. He didn't panic. Instead, he sat at his desk for a long while, rereading the document in complete silence. When the boys asked why he looked upset, he told them it was just something he needed to fix, and that nothing would change for them. But inside, he was already preparing for war. He called his legal team that night. They worked quickly. They filed a countermotion, submitted the DNA test results, medical updates, school records, and dozens of character references from teachers, doctors, and even hotel staff who had witnessed Henry's care firsthand. But Henry knew that in court, facts alone wouldn't be enough. The judge would be looking not just at his actions, but at the emotional bond he had built with the boys. He would have to prove he wasn't just a guardian on paper, but a father in every way that counted. The boys sensed the tension, even though Henry tried to shield them from the details. One evening, after dinner, Zach quietly asked, "Are we going to have to leave?" Henry shook his head, then crouched down so they were eye to eye. "No one is taking you from me. I will fight with everything I have to keep you safe." It was the first time Henry had said it out loud, not just to them, but to himself. Lucas looked at him and asked, "Even if she says we're not hers?" Henry didn't understand the question at first. Then Lucas added, "That lady came to the hospital once. I heard her say we were a burden. That mommy would have never made it with us around." Henry felt something inside him harden. This woman wasn't just a stranger, she was toxic. And now she wanted control over two boys who had already survived enough. The court hearing was scheduled quickly, within 2 weeks. In that time, Henry's days were filled with quiet dread and steady determination. He continued their routines without change, school drop-offs, homework, nighttime stories, but at night, once they were asleep, he read court precedents and testimonials, practiced his statement with his lawyers, and looked over every photo he had taken with them since that day in the restaurant. Each picture told the same story, a man who had stepped into a broken place and stayed. Not perfectly. Not easily. But fully. When the court date arrived, Henry dressed the boys in clean, soft clothes and brought them with him. He told them they didn't have to say anything unless they wanted to. Lucas clung to his bunny the entire time, and Zach sat straight-backed beside Henry, his expression unreadable. Carol Monroe sat on the opposite side of the room, dressed sharply, her face tight with confidence. She barely looked at the boys. Instead, she recited lines about family tradition and the importance of blood ties. Henry remained calm. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He simply told the truth. He told the court about the moment he saw them, about learning they were his sons, about every step he had taken since to keep them safe, warm, and loved. He didn't need drama. He had facts, and 2 small boys who reached for his hand without thinking. At the end of the session, the judge asked if either child wanted to speak. There was a long silence. Then Zach stood. He walked to the front of the room and looked directly at the judge. His voice didn't shake. He didn't leave us. He didn't ignore us. He didn't call us a burden. He found us. And he stayed. That was all. It was everything. Later that day, the court ruled in Henry's favor. Guardianship was upheld, and Carol Monroe's petition was dismissed in full. The judge acknowledged the emotional harm her involvement might have caused and granted Henry the right to request a restraining order if necessary. Henry didn't celebrate. He simply took the boys home. That night, they all sat on the couch, tangled in a blanket, watching an old movie none of them cared about. When it ended, Lucas leaned against Henry's shoulder and mumbled, "Told you we were already a real family." And Henry, heart full and arms around them both, finally allowed himself to believe it. After the court hearing, life began to feel quieter, but not in the way that meant emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, the silence that followed long battles fought and survived. Henry, Zach, and Lucas slipped into something new, something more permanent. The boys began to relax in ways they hadn't before. They no longer asked what would happen tomorrow or if they'd need to pack their things. They stopped watching the door when Henry left the room, as if waiting for him to disappear. Instead, they woke up knowing he would be there. He started calling them his sons in everyday conversation without needing to pause or correct himself. They called him Dad with increasing confidence, as if they'd always known him that way. With the guardianship officially secure, Henry shifted his focus to helping the boys heal from more than just legal instability. He hired a child therapist to come once a week, someone kind and soft-spoken who made them laugh during their sessions and never forced them to talk about things they weren't ready to share. Sometimes, Zach opened up first, speaking in slow, precise words about memories he'd locked away. Other times, Lucas would burst into the room after a session with crayon drawings of monsters that were really metaphors for things he didn't want to name. Henry kept every drawing, folding them carefully into a large notebook that he told them was only for the brave. He began to take them places beyond the park or grocery store. They went to the Science Museum, where Lucas spent nearly 30 minutes pressing every button in the electricity exhibit, and Zach got lost in the dinosaur skeletons. He took them to the beach one weekend, even though Henry himself hadn't stood barefoot in sand in over 20 years. The boys built uneven castles and chased each other into the waves. Henry sat in a chair nearby, watching them run, and felt something close to peace ripple through him. It was new, but it fit. Back home, the penthouse had shifted even more. The clean white walls now held framed drawings, fingerprint smudges, and uneven rows of photos taped next to the fridge. The dining table, once used only for formal meetings or silent solo dinners, became the heart of the house. Spilled juice, pancake crumbs, board games, and spontaneous math homework covered it regularly. Henry didn't miss the order. He welcomed the chaos. But despite the progress, not everything was easy. One night, Zach had a panic attack. It came out of nowhere, triggered by a distant siren and the sound of something dropping in the hallway. He froze, breathing fast, eyes wide and terrified. Henry reacted instinctively. He pulled him into his arms and didn't ask questions. He just held him and repeated, "You're safe. I've got you. No one's going to hurt you." Zach clung to him for a long time before finally whispering, "I used to dream that we'd disappear and no one would notice." Henry swallowed the lump in his throat and said, "If you ever disappear again, I'll be the one searching the world to find you." A few days later, Lucas left a note on Henry's pillow. It was messy, written in blue marker with backwards letters. It said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Henry didn't sleep that night. He sat in their room, watching them breathe in the dark, and made a silent promise that nothing, not his past, not his fear, not even Emily's uncertain condition, would stop him from being their father in every way that mattered. Meanwhile, updates from the hospital trickled in. Emily's condition was stable, but unchanged. Henry continued visiting, sitting by her bed, updating her on the boys, telling her stories about the smallest moments, the time Zach corrected a teacher politely, or when Lucas learned how to whistle and wouldn't stop for days. He brought pictures, recordings, even one of Lucas's monster drawings taped to a bouquet. The nurses said they weren't sure if she could hear him, but Henry talked to her anyway, because some part of him needed to believe she might wake up one day and know her sons had found their way to someone who stayed. One evening, as the city lights flickered on outside the windows, Henry sat with the boys watching a movie, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Zach turned and said, "If Mommy wakes up, can she come live with us too?" The question caught Henry off guard. He thought carefully before answering. "If she wants to, and if she's well enough, we'll figure it out together." Zach nodded and leaned against him. "I just don't want to lose what we have now." Henry wrapped an arm around both of them and said, "You won't. I promise." And in that moment, he realized that everything he once thought he needed, success, control, certainty, had been replaced by something softer but infinitely stronger. He had built a life that mattered, not by design, but by love, by effort, and by the simple decision to stay. Henry was in the middle of folding laundry in the boys' room, something he'd learned to do surprisingly well in recent weeks, when his phone rang. The hospital's name flashed on the screen, and time seemed to pause around him. He answered quickly, heart tightening with every second of silence on the other end until the nurse's voice finally came through. Emily was awake. Disoriented and weak, but conscious. Henry stood still for several seconds, laundry forgotten in his hands, as the words settled into his mind. She had come back. After all this time. After all the uncertainty. She was awake. He didn't take the boys with him that day. He needed to see her first, to understand what kind of state she was in, what kind of person she was now. So much had changed. He had changed. And so had her children. When he arrived at the hospital, he was led to her room by the same nurse who had seen him through so many visits. The blinds were open, letting in soft afternoon light, and the machine still beeped softly, but the woman in the bed was not just a patient anymore, she was alert, her eyes open and tracking movement. She looked up at him the moment he stepped in, and her lips parted in a whisper. "Henry." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. He walked in slowly, pulling a chair beside her bed, unsure how to begin. She looked tired, smaller somehow, but there was clarity in her eyes that he hadn't seen even when they were together years ago. "They told me you've been visiting," she said, her voice rough and quiet. "I didn't think you'd come." He nodded. "I didn't know where you were. For a long time. And then I found Zach and Lucas. They came to one of my restaurants." Emily's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. She turned her face slightly toward the wall, blinking quickly. "I didn't know what else to do. After they were born, everything fell apart so fast. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought maybe if I kept them safe and quiet, the world wouldn't notice how much I was failing." Henry let her speak. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. She told him bits and pieces about the years after she'd left. She had no support system, no steady job, and a pregnancy she was too afraid to tell him about. She thought disappearing would protect everyone. But over time, she had disappeared from herself too, slipping into exhaustion and silence until the accident that had nearly ended everything. "You didn't fail them," Henry said softly. "You kept them alive. And now, they're here. They're safe. They're amazing." "Do they know?" she asked. He nodded again. "They know everything. And they call me Dad." Emily smiled at that, a small, trembling curve of her mouth. "They should." She didn't ask for anything right away. She didn't demand custody or try to rewrite the past. Instead, she asked him to tell her what they liked, what made them laugh, what scared them. He sat there for over an hour, describing every moment he could remember, their bedtime routines, the way Zach liked his sandwiches cut into triangles, the way Lucas made up wild bedtime stories that never had endings. Emily listened like someone starving for connection, and Henry gave it to her, piece by piece. When he finally stood to leave, she reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you for finding them," she said. "Thank you for not letting them get lost." He didn't say "you're welcome." He didn't say it was nothing. He simply nodded, because they both knew what it had cost him, and what it had given him in return. Back home, he told the boys gently that their mother was awake. Their reactions were mixed. Lucas was excited and wanted to see her right away, while Zach went quiet, his hands tightening around the edge of the couch cushion. Henry didn't push. He told them they could visit when they were ready, and until then, he'd keep going on their behalf. Over the next few days, he visited Emily daily. She gained strength slowly, both physically and emotionally. She asked more about the boys, and he brought her drawings, audio messages, even a short video of Lucas pretending to be a superhero in the living room. She cried openly when she watched it. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. They focused on now. Eventually, the time came when both boys were ready. Henry brought them to the hospital, walking through the hall with one boy holding each of his hands. The moment Emily saw them, her eyes filled again, and she held out her arms. They didn't run to her. They approached carefully, quietly, and hugged her gently, almost as if afraid she would vanish again. But she didn't. She held them close and whispered things only they could hear. When they left that day, Zach looked up at Henry and asked, "Is it okay if I still call you Dad?" Henry knelt and said, "You can always call me Dad. Nothing's going to change that." And in that hallway, beneath the fluorescent lights, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and the weight of their shared history behind them, they stood together not as broken pieces but as a family that had survived something. Not perfectly. Not painlessly. But together. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, so did everything else. Emily was released from the hospital 2 months after she first woke up. Her recovery was steady but cautious, and she chose to live in an apartment just a few blocks away from Henry and the boys. They didn't rush into anything. There were no declarations of shared parenting or sudden reunifications. Instead, they built something quiet and respectful, coexistence that grew from mutual care and acknowledgement of the past. Emily visited often, but never overstepped. She helped with homework, brought over meals, and sometimes just sat with the boys in the park while Henry watched from a bench, learning to let go of the part of him that still carried fear. Fear that something would come and undo it all. By then, Henry had made significant changes to his life. He had stepped down from his role as CEO, naming a trusted deputy to take over day-to-day operations. The board had initially resisted, worried about stability and profit margins, but Henry didn't waver. His time was now measured in school drop-offs, family dinners, and bedtime routines. His apartment, once cold, sleek, and silent, was now cluttered with life. Drawings lined the walls. A laundry basket was always full. There were mismatched socks on the floor, cereal boxes on the counter, and a new sound he had grown to crave, laughter. Zach and Lucas had changed too. Their eyes no longer held that ever-present caution. They smiled freely, fought over silly things, and talked about the future with confidence instead of doubt. They had their own personalities, so different but so perfectly connected. Zach was still quiet, careful with his words, but he had become more affectionate, more trusting. Lucas was a whirlwind of imagination and energy, constantly dragging Henry into new missions or storytelling games. They had their traditions now, Friday pizza nights, Sunday park visits, and Wednesday mornings where Henry tried to cook something new and usually failed, to the boys' great amusement. One weekend, they hosted a small celebration, not a party, not a ceremony, just something simple to mark what had become official. The adoption was finalized. Though Henry had already been their legal guardian, this made it permanent. There would be no more hearings, no more threats, no more questions about who belonged to whom. It was all settled. Henry sat at the kitchen table that evening with a soft smile as the boys presented him with a handmade card. Inside, in uneven handwriting and crayon drawings, were the words, "We're yours forever now. But really, you were ours first." Emily joined them later, and they had dinner as a family. It wasn't perfect. She still carried guilt. Henry still had regrets. But none of it seemed to matter in that moment. What they had built wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about choosing each other every day after. That night, after the boys were asleep, Henry stood in their doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing. The nightlight cast soft shapes on the wall. He thought about the man he had been when he first saw them in that restaurant, distant, untouchable, locked away in a tower of ambition and isolation. He couldn't reconcile that version of himself with the one who now knew exactly how to soothe a nightmare or braid hair or decode the difference between hungry tears and tired ones. He moved to the window, looking out over the city, and realized he didn't miss his old life. Not the boardrooms, not the accolades, not the headlines. He had found something richer. Not in numbers or success, but in connection. In responsibility. In love. When he finally turned off the lights and lay down to sleep, he felt no weight of what could go wrong, only the quiet peace of what had gone right. They had made it, together. Through abandonment, doubt, fear, and fight. They had built something permanent. Not because it was easy. But because, despite everything, they had chosen to stay. And that choice, made again and again in the small everyday moments, was what made them a family. Not by accident. Not by obligation. But by love. What makes the ending of this story so moving is that it doesn't rely on grand gestures, it's about quiet, earned transformation. Henry starts out as a man defined by control, power, and detachment. He's not cruel, but he's distant, convinced that love and vulnerability are distractions from success. And yet, through the eyes and hearts of two little boys who had every reason not to trust the world, he learns that presence is more powerful than perfection. The ending doesn't promise a flawless future. Emily still carries pain, Henry still has moments of doubt, and the boys are still healing. But what makes it beautiful is that all of them choose to stay. They choose to rebuild not because they're forced to, but because they believe in something better than what they came from. That's rare, and honest, and incredibly powerful. To me, the story is ultimately about redemption, not dramatic, cinematic redemption, but the kind that happens in small, steady moments. In bedtime stories. In burnt pancakes. In a quiet promise, I'm not going anywhere. And that is what makes the ending not just satisfying, but deeply human.